Region Europe is the international program of the University of Turin, pursuing a comprehensive knowledge of the European model of regional integration and of the EU as a global actor. The involvement of 45 guest lecturers coming from all across the world's most prestigious universities and institutions allows us to bring fresh and critical perspectives on crucial issues concerning European integration and the role of the EU in world affairs, with a forward-looking approach. We want to introduce you to how the EU actually works from its beating heart, visiting its institutions and interacting with its actors. From its first edition, each year Region Europe has given the opportunity to more than 150 students coming from all over the world to gather and exchange views and experiences.
Thank you, Giovanni. It's really a pleasure to be back to Turin, at least in such a remote fashion. In the spirit of full disclosure, I have to say that Turin was the first Italian city I visited when I was a student many, many years ago. And as you might guess, the impression was overwhelming. And since that time, I visited many places in Italy, but Turin and Piedmont remain my favorite in this country. And I'm particularly glad that I'm in a position to keep contacts to the distinguished University of Turin, which stands out as one of the best educational institutions, not just in Italy, but I would venture to say in Europe at large. So I was glad to get this invitation, and the topic is, of course, very broad. So I decided that I would give you just a couple of my own judgments about what's going on in Russia as far as the European Union is concerned, to what extent we can hope for a change in the relationship, and also to outline the obstacles for this change. So the topic of the lecture is what do Russians think about the European Union as a partner and as a role model? And I have to start with saying that for us in Russia, these two questions are just an introduction to the third question, which is much more fundamental and I would even say metaphysical for Russians. Are Russians really European? Are we a part of the same family of nations with our own history, with our specific attitude towards the state, with our Orthodox Christianity, but still are we of the same family? And indeed, every time when you look at the Kremlin, you are reminded that we share at least the Italian legacy in architecture, because part of the Kremlin was designed and constructed by Italians. And you can see, of course, a lot of European legacy in St. Petersburg and in many other Russian towns. So this is one view, that we are Europeans. And if we are Europeans, then it's not about partnership, or it's not even about a role model, it's rather about identity. If we identify ourselves with Europe, it means that it's not a choice, but rather a destiny. However, there is a different viewpoint that Russians are not exactly Europeans. They do have some important features of Europe, but given their history, given their culture, given the ethnic composition of the Russian society, you cannot identify Russia with Europe only. It's rather a Eurasian state with very mixed cultural and social patterns. So depending on how you answer the question, you might come up with very different conclusions. Let me start with the, I would say, European vision. And personally, I tend to share most of the elements of this vision, but let me describe the views of the liberal part of the Russian society and the liberal part of the Russian political class. The perception is that, of course, Russia is Europe. And if it is Europe, if it is destiny, not a choice, then the question is about when Russia gets back to Europe. For many liberals in my country, the answer to the question is primarily about the time and about the price that the country has to pay for its unfortunate deviation from the European trajectory. So in terms of the timing, optimists argue that basically already 2024 might be a major change in the Russian strategic posture. It might be the year of a U-turn away from the Asian priority back to the European origins. Indeed, 2024 is associated with many changes, potential changes at least, not just in Russia, but also here in Europe. It might be also an important change in the United States. So they look at this year as something that might be a watershed between the past and the future, between the beginning of the century and the middle of the century. Of course, it's a very optimistic view, and its critics believe that probably it would be premature to expect 2024 to become a milestone, a pivot year for the Russian foreign policy, and specifically for the social changes within the Russian Federation. So they would say that probably we should look not at 2024, but rather at 2030, and maybe even we should look at a later date, let's say 2035, something like that, because that would mean the end, the physical phasing out of the Putin generation in power. It would mean that there'll be very few people left in Russia who still remember the Soviet Union, and the new generation with its new values, with its new lifestyles, with its command of foreign languages, with its new education, might become a real pivot to the nearly lost European agenda. Sorry. So the second question about this transition is, of course, the question of price. And again, you have an optimistic view and a more pessimistic view. And an optimist would say that, well, it is still possible to get back to Europe in a chain of orderly, incremental, consequential economic, social, and political reforms. It's not impossible. So this transition might start in a couple of years from now. It will take some time, but in the end of the day, it will be there without a major disruption of the political, social, and economic systems. However, of course, there is an opposite view that basically the Russian political system as it exists now has already passed the point of no return. The perception is that it's too late to expect a gradual shift from the current system, which can be labeled as political authoritarianism and state capitalism.
Andrei, do you need a break?
No, that's fine. That's fine. Sorry.
Okay. No, don't worry.
That basically, it's too late to take a gradual, incremental, and orderly path to a new political and social system. And that basically we have to get back to where we were in 1991. Basically what we have to do is to finish the unfinished job of completely dismantling the post-Soviet system which we still have in this country. This is clearly a pessimistic view because it would imply not just an evolutionary transition to a new system, but rather a revolutionary breakdown of the existing system, and then to have a new structure built in its place. So, what are the foundations for such a position? What is the rationale for such an approach? I would single out three basic arguments that liberals use to somehow substantiate their logic and their narrative. First of all, and this is more or less evident, liberals in Russia argue that Russians, and not just ethnic Russians, but also other nations that exist in the Russian Federation. For example, Tatars or other ethnic groups. They are predominantly European by their history, by their culture, by their lifestyle, and their core values, not Asians. Europe remains the principal magnet for Russian students, cultural figures, artists, business people, scientists, intellectuals, and civil servants. Europe has the world's largest Russian and Russian-speaking diasporas, including mixed marriages between people. Of course, Europe has always been the center of gravity for Russian reformers. So, from this viewpoint, it is even pointless to speak of the European option for Russia. It's a matter of the Russian destiny rather than of choice. Second, they would argue Europe is important because only Europe can become an effective driver for Russia's economic and social modernization. Europe is interested not just in Russia's natural resources, but also in unleashing the Russian human capital. Of course, Russia still has a tradition of fundamental research. It has a creative population, and that might be a natural complement to what they have in Europe. Russia and Europe together might constitute a formidable cocktail of intellectual power and its applications. If you look to Asia, you do not see such an incentive of Asian countries to work with Russia, because essentially Asians and specifically China are quite happy with having Russia as almost unlimited repository of natural resources. Clear enough, if you look for social models, if you look for cooperation between universities, if you look at potential collaboration in research and development, Europe might be much more attractive than Asia is. And finally, if you take such a pro-European view, you would probably also argue, and this is popular specifically among scholars who deal with international relations, it's popular to state that in Europe, Russia will be one of the peers. It is comparable in terms of its size, in terms of its economic and demographic weight. While in Asia, especially if you look into the future of Asia, if you look to 20, 30 years away from now, Russia is likely to be squeezed between rising giants, such as China and India in particular, but not only, even countries like Indonesia or Pakistan, at least in terms of their population, will be much bigger than Russia is today and will be in the foreseeable future. So when Russia gets to Europe, it's among approximately equal states. And that means that it can play an equal role. Maybe in some areas it can be even a leader. In Asia, on the contrary, Russia is likely to be downgraded to a second-tier state. And of course, this is not a position that a great power would like to have. Therefore, it's almost natural for Russia to drive back for Europe if Russia does not to become a junior partner to rising Asian countries like China, India, and others. So this is the position. And if you stick to the position, basically you can argue that Europe should exercise some kind of strategic patience. It cannot really influence the Russian transformation, which is common, but it will not happen overnight. Europe should not worry about Russia, because Russia, like a disobedient teenager who runs away from his home, will soon have to face this strange, rough, and sometimes unfriendly environment, which will incentivize the teenager to get back to where he or she belongs. So Europe might essentially wait, and it might very cautiously incentivize Russia to accelerate this transition. It can offer opportunities for the Russian civil society, as well as for target audiences like the younger generation, small business managers, technocrats, civil servants, people who are likely to be pro-European and who are likely to accelerate this inevitable transition of Russia back to Europe. So this is the narrative. This is the narrative about Russia, about its relations with Europe, about inevitability of Russia getting back to where it belongs. However, there are certain caveats here. And I think that the major problem with this vision is that people who share this vision look not at Europe today, but at Europe as it was 10, 20, or even 30 years ago. It's a Europe without the Eurozone crisis. It's a Europe without Brexit. It's a Europe without the recent rise of populism. Of course, it's a Europe where Russia and the European Union are divided by the conflict in Ukraine and by some other unfortunate events of last years. So it's a kind of a romantic vision of Europe as it should be, not as it is, not as it is likely to become in 10, 20 years ago, but it's a kind of nostalgic vision of the heydays of the European project. I think that definitely, if we look at the contemporary European developments, we'll see that this narrative has significant vulnerabilities. And those who criticize the European vision for Russia, they try to emphasize these liabilities of the liberal view. Let me give you just as an example, the liberal approach and the neoconservative approach in Russia to why basically the first attempt to get Russia back into Europe failed. And let me compare Russia and Poland. Very interesting comparison in my view. Usually liberals say, Russia failed to get into Europe for two reasons. The first reason was that Russia couldn't integrate itself into European institutions. Russia was marginalized in Europe. It didn't get into NATO. And since NATO is the only game in town as far as security is concerned, to be out of NATO means to be on the margins of the European security system. Russia failed to get to the European Union. It never really tried to get into the European Union. But if the European Union is the key driver of the European development, if it is the core of the economic system in Europe, it means that if you're out of the European Union, you are out of Europe. So that's the first reason why Russia allegedly failed to get back to Europe in 1990s and later. The second explanation is a systems one. One can argue that over the last 30 years, Russia failed to find a new social and economic system that would be compatible with the European one. Russia got stuck with its state capitalism. It never succeeded in promoting small business. And basically what we see right now in Russia is social and economic stagnation. So society was ruptured by the state. Nationalism and militarism became the principal new source of legitimacy for the state and for the leaders in the Russian Federation. And predictably, that led to a collapse of relations between Russia and the European Union. That looks fine, but this concept breaks down when we compare Russia and contemporary Poland. Because from the liberal view, Poland serves as a perfect counterexample to Russia. Poland solved the two problems which Russia failed to address properly. On the one hand, Poland was very successful in getting integrated into major European institutions, both the European Union and the NATO alliance. Some would say that in both these institutions, Warsaw is able to punch above its weight. It is very active, very influential, very interactive. At the same time, one can argue that Poland accomplished what Russia failed to accomplish in the social and in the economic domains. Poland was one of the most successful, if not the most successful, new EU member in terms of its economic development. Look at the annual economic growth of Poland. Look at the Polish small business. Very vibrant economy which made full use of the country's integration to the European Union. However, what we see in Poland is that all this success story did not prevent a nationalistic backlash in this country. And when I talk to some of my Polish friends, they make parallels between what's going on in Poland right now with the growing nationalism, with its Euroscepticism and other manifestations of this resurgent, rather archaic national identity, and what's going on in Russia. So if this successful integration does not really guarantee a change, deep change, profound change in values, if this old national identity prevails over the European identity, if it happens in Poland, it means that definitely it can happen in Russia as well. Another example, when liberals say the future of Russia is with Europe, their opponents say, well, look at Ukraine. Look at Ukraine. And suppose for a second that in 10 years from now, in 20 years from now, we will have something similar to the Revolution of Dignity, to Maidan Square in Kiev. And the new leadership of Russia, which will be very pro-European, very liberal, would say that the only path for the country is to get closer to the European Union and ultimately even to join the European Union. What would it mean for Russia? How many years Russia will have to wait till the European Union considers an association, not to mention a membership for Russia in the Union? How we will handle all these grievances, these historical sentiments, which are so difficult to overcome? How we will manage uneasy relations with our immediate Western neighbors? So basically, the conclusion is that even if Russia gets back to where it was in early 1990s, it's not likely that we will get ahead of Turkey in terms of potential joining the European Union. And definitely it's not an option. It's not an option that can be considered. Now, historically, there were three attempts of Russia to somehow find a modus operandi with its European neighbors. And all the three, unfortunately, failed. Let me just remind you of them. The first attempt, early 1990s, the perception was that this new greater Europe should be based on pan-European institutions. And it should be based on enhanced OSCE system, so that we will have an institutional foundation covering all the continent, not just its western part. And it failed. Again, I was a witness to this failure. I have my own grievances and my own sentiments about that. I think both sides turned out to be unprepared to delegate more power and more authority to OSCE or to the Council of Europe. And it turned out to become a potential institutional competitor to Western organizations like NATO, for example. And there was no appetite to turn it into something stronger and to something that could really unite all of us. The second attempt was, okay, we cannot have pan-European institutions. NATO is not going to be reformed. The European Union has its own limitations. But let us then give Russia special status in this new European system. In NATO, that was the incarnation of this special status was, of course, the NATO-Russia Council. With the European Union, it was the project of 4 spaces of cooperation between Russia and the Union. Unfortunately, neither worked out because the basic challenge is how to give Russia a say in European affairs without giving the Kremlin a veto power. And in the end of the day, basically the NATO-Russia Council evolved not as a decision-making body, but rather as an information center. And in terms of the economic relations with Russia, the European Union insisted on acquis communautaire. But it was very difficult for Russia to accept these two arrangements. It was difficult to accept that Russia is not engaged in the security decision-making in Europe, that we are invited to a cocktail party, but not to a dinner after the party. And it was also very difficult to accept that we will have to abide by acquis communautaire as an ascending country, as a country with an aspiration to join the European Union. So it turned out that, unfortunately, neither of these models worked. And finally, the last attempt, the most recent attempt, was to try to somehow build this new Europe on two foundations. The Western Foundation, the European Union and NATO, and the Eastern Foundation, the Eurasian Economic Union, and CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. However, the West found this arrangement unpractical. Of course, the perception in the West was that whatever Russia can put together in the eastern part of the Eurasian continent is not a match to either NATO or to the European Union. And basically, we cannot consider these organizations to be peers to our organizations with a long history and with a clear accomplishment. Now let me get to Asia. Asia is rough. The environment is more difficult than it is in Europe. Russia is likely to face fierce competition from Asian countries. But there are two advantages that Asia has in comparison to Europe in the eyes of many Russian decision makers and to some extent in the eyes of the population. First of all, there are no nations in Asia that take Russia as an existential threat to their existence. Of course, Russia's history of relations with Asian neighbors is also complicated and sometimes quite painful for both sides. We have problems with Japan, we have problems with China, we have problems with a number of other Asian countries. However, these countries look at Russia not as a threat in most cases, but rather as an opportunity. These are big countries. They are bigger, some of them are bigger than Russia. They don't have a problem of identity, like, for example, Ukraine. They consider Russia to be something that they can use to their advantage. So these existential issues, which are likely to remain for a long time between Russia and its Western neighbors, especially neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe, do not exist in Asia. And this is, of course, a major advantage. The second advantage of Asia is that essentially the Eurasian project is not carved in stone. It's not the European project, which has already got a lot of traditions, a lot of rigid bureaucratic layers of decision making. The Eurasian project is still very nascent, which means that the entrance ticket to the Eurasian club does not cost as much as a similar ticket to enter the European club. Russia can still become an equal partner to the founding members of the Eurasian institutions. It might even become a founding father of some of them. That's why Russia has been so active in putting together the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS. The assumption is that if we get to this project early enough, we are in a much better position to shape its future compared to a project which has already developed a lot of inertia and a lot of its own logic. However, having said that, I'd like to emphasize that if institutionally and geopolitically Russia moves to Asia, it does not mean that Russia ceases, stops, or somehow downgrades its European identity. And Russia might be an important partner in Asia only if it sticks to its European identity, because it's important for Russia to demonstrate to its Asian partners that it is different. Let me give you another example. Why Australia or New Zealand turned out to be so successful in Asian Pacific. These are relatively small countries compared to Asian giants. However, they were successful because they demonstrated to their partners that they are different, that they can bring to the Asian Pacific environment something unique, something that other partners simply do not have. And my take is that even if Russia turns to Asia, it means that it can do that only by emphasizing its primarily European identity. And if Russia loses this identity, it's very difficult to see what kind of specific role it can play in the Asian environment. So let me end with saying that the future Russian attitude to Europe, and that will be very trivial, but let me just say that a lot in this relationship will depend on the future of the European project itself. Because if the European project turns out to be successful, if the current crisis in Europe is overcome, I think Russia will be back, and definitely Europe will remain the center of gravity for the Russian society. If, God forbid, the European project fails and Europe becomes just an assorted combination of small, relatively small states with a lack of economic drive, with antiquated social systems, then I think Russians will gradually turn to the East. It's too premature to draw such future today. I think that the expectations are in Russia that Europe will recover, that Europe will remain one of the most vibrant, one of the most innovative, and one of the most pleasant parts of the world. But of course, the jury is still in session. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrey. And there are already some questions for you. The first one is from Eleonora, who asks whether you can go back for a minute to the OSCE. And if you can repeat your ideas about the future of the OSCE, as of course the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was established as a bridge, between East and West, and there are many colleagues talking about a new Cold War between East and West. And on the other hand, other colleagues propose to launch a kind of OSCE in other contexts of the world. For example, consider the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so on. So, what do you think about the future of the OSCE and its relevance in pan-European relations?
Well, it's a very good question, especially because we now celebrate the 30-year anniversary of the Paris Charter that was signed, I think it was November of 1990. And we just had a small workshop led by OSCE on this anniversary. And my take is that we talk about the Paris Charter as something that shows our common past. But I think that instead we should think about the Paris Charter as something that should guide us to our common future. And indeed, if you look at this document, it is a spectacular piece of paper in terms of the vision. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. I think both sides should take responsibility for this failure. I do remember that back in the early 1990s, I was engaged in some discussions in the Kremlin about the future for OSCE. It was very difficult to inspire the Russian leadership to pay more attention to this organization. They were thinking about big stuff. They were thinking about how Russia should join G7, how Russia should build its relations with NATO. But OSCE, then it was CSE, was not big enough to capture their imagination. And of course, on the Western side, there were concerns that you folks are trying to replace NATO with OSCE, and we don't want it. We don't want NATO to be dissolved in this very big and very ambiguous organization, especially because, legally speaking, it's not even clear what OSCE is. It's not an NGO, but it's not an interstate institution either. So I think that right now, if you take the current situation, I would say that we should definitely aim high, but we should act in a very modest way. My suggestion would be to look back at OSCE, or rather to look back at the all-European process, not of 1990, which unfortunately we have to work hard to get back to. But why don't we look at the situation of 1975, when they signed the Helsinki Final Act? After all, CSE was built not to promote cooperation between like-minded countries, but to promote understanding and cooperation between very different players. And I think that right now we should think primarily about how we manage the competition, or sometimes even confrontation, between the East and the West, how we can reduce the costs of this confrontation and cut down the risks associated with this confrontation. So in my opinion, we should make one step back, and even probably we should look at how OSCE was used during the last stage of the Cold War. If we're able to work on such issues like confidence-building measures, like a new security agenda in Europe, like peace building, and for example, all critics of OSCE somehow forget that OSCE turned out to be the only institution which played an important role in the Ukrainian crisis of 2014. It was OSCE. It was not the United Nations, not NATO, not the NATO-Russia Council. It was OSCE which dispatched its observers and helped to reduce the bloodshed. It is OSCE which is so active in the Balkans. So I happen to be a very strong believer in OSCE, but I also realize that in order to be realistic, we should look at very small, very incremental opportunities that would allow us to gradually rebuild and restore the European order, or at least the European spirit of 1990.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question here from Brazil, if I'm right. Vinicius, can you turn on your camera and pose the questions directly to Dr. Kortunov? Vinicius, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Dr. Kortunov, for the presentation. It was great. And my question goes back a little to what you said. You mentioned that Russia could not get into the European institutions in the 90s, and then you mentioned you mentioned Ukraine as an example of what may happen to Russia in the future. And I was thinking, there are some people and there are some terrorists who is an imperialist institution or an imperialist polity that conquers not by force like the former imperial powers, but by enticement, by getting these countries willing to be part of the European project, to say that way. In these terms, what about seeing Russia seeing the European Union as a competitor that is taking Russian influence zone out of the hands of Russia? And two examples of it will be Ukraine, that you just mentioned, and Georgia, that have clearly shown the willingness to Europeanize themselves.
It's definitely a good question, and I think there is this sense of competition, and I think that in many ways it's also a manifestation of the inertia of the political thinking, because the perception is that these are our countries, and we are entitled to lead them. But let me just to get back to the European perspective. Let me compare two important developments. On the one hand, what we saw over the last 30 years was an attempt by the European Union, a natural attempt to expand to the east, to expand geographically, to have more partners and maybe even new members in the east along the Russian western periphery. At the same time, we saw a very active Chinese engagement in the eastern periphery of Russia, specifically in Central Asia. China has become very active there, developing economic trade relations with these countries. We now see a lot of Chinese in Central Asia. For many countries, China is already the #1 trading partner and the biggest investor. So if you are sitting in the Kremlin, and if you compare these two trends, what trend should you be more concerned about? Should you be more concerned about the European Union moving east, or should you be more concerned about China going west? I think that conventional wisdom suggests that Russia should be more concerned about the Chinese advance rather than about the EU advance. First of all, because the European advance is slow and sometimes inconsistent, and basically we see that the European Union has probably exhausted its potential for enlargement. On the other hand, you can consider that China takes a long-term perspective and its engagement is much more significant, and its long-term strategy might be a much more formidable challenge to Moscow. However, in reality, it was the other way around. Russia took a very benign view on the Chinese engagement in Central Asia, and still has such a benign view. And Russia has demonstrated a lot of concern about the West getting more influence and more leverage in the western part of what used to be the Soviet Union. Why? I think simply Chinese played it much better than Europeans did. First of all, Chinese were cautious to consult with Moscow on every single big project they were considering in Central Asia. When I spoke to assistants to Mr. Barroso back in 2013, and when I suggested maybe, the European Union should consult with Moscow on its plans to grant Ukraine their socialist status. Of course, the answer was Ukraine is a sovereign state. That's why we're not going to discuss with you anything. Once we get to this agreement, maybe, we will discuss with you the implications of this agreement for us. That's the first difference. Chinese have always been very cautious on that. Second, Chinese have always been ready to wrap their advances in Central Asia into some kind of multilateral framework, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this multilateral framework made their advances less challenging, at least in formal sense, because we are all members of the same organization. Within this organization, we try to increase trade. So if you wish, if I were to put it cynically, this multilateral framework allowed China to camouflage its expansion. Now, the European Union never accepted that. In fact, the former Soviet Union was arguably the only space where the European Union did not support regional integration, because the European Union has always been concerned about Russia trying to use this integration in order to restore the Soviet Union, which of course is absurd, but that's the vision which is still present in Europe, at least in my view. And finally, the last but clearly not the least, China has always honored the strategic leadership of Russia in Central Asia. And when you talk to Chinese, they would all say, oh yeah, sure, we understand. You are the security provider for these countries. We don't want to challenge that. We don't want to open our military bases on the territory of Central Asia. You will provide the security for them and for us, for our investments and for our trade. Of course, it's not the case with the European Union or with NATO. It would be absurd to imagine that NATO would respect Russia's security interests on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Therefore, we have what we have right now. We have Russia taking a very benign attitude towards the Chinese expansion in Central Asia, but also Russia, which is very suspicious to any EU, not to mention NATO, advances in the former Soviet Union. I'm not sure that the European Union can imitate the Chinese approach, but at least this is a lesson that can be taken into consideration.
Okay, so there is a question from George, but I think you have already answered, because what's the perception in Russia about the Chinese penetration in Central Asian countries, Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan? Yes, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I can only add that, of course, it would be wrong to say that there are no concerns. There are concerns about China becoming in Central Asia and about Russia losing its influence, be it economic, strategic, or cultural. But I think that there are at least two caveats here. First of all, Central Asia is not the main target of the Chinese expansion. The main target of the Chinese expansion is the Pacific, not Central Asia. Central Asia is a landlocked part of the world. It is relatively poor. It is relatively small. So it is important primarily as a transit corridor. It's important to promote the Silk Road initiative, but the destination is not Central Asia. The destination is Europe. And this is something that we should keep in mind. Also, if you take the Silk Road approach, I would venture to say that the maritime dimension for China is much more important than the land dimension. Just look at the sheer numbers of cargo, which is moved from China by land and by sea, and that's clear. Second, I think that what we should also keep in mind is that to some extent, the advancement of China creates, in a paradoxical way, certain opportunities for Russia, because many Central Asian leaders and their political elites and their businessmen are getting concerned about a prospect of being swallowed by China. So they would they would try to maintain their ties with Russia as a potential counterbalance to China. And that's one of the reasons why we have this Eurasian Economic Union, because everybody understands that, if we deal with Chinese alone, not together with each other, our negotiating positions with China are getting less attractive. So I think that there are reasons to be concerned, but if we are looking at the immediate future, probably the most threatening development is a potential fast withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan and potential radicalization of Central Asia. Unfortunately, the level of political stability in the region is not that high, and we've just seen a mutiny and a public unrest in Kyrgyzstan. I think this is something that represents a more immediate challenge than the growing influence of China in Central Asia. Giovanni, unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. So there is a question from Enrique, who can turn on his camera. And
don't have a camera, sorry. My PC have one.
Okay, microphone. Okay.
So good afternoon, Mr. Kortunov. I am going to address what probably can be considered the elephant in the room, as we say in Italian. That being that, in my opinion, the great fracture that exists between Russia and Europe is not rather one of culture or ethnicity, but is rather one made by politicians and it's made by some decisions by Russian government. There has been numerous instances in international scenarios where Russia didn't really had a positive influence. I think about the Russian mercenaries that were sent in Libya during the civil conflict, which technically under international law, since private citizens are still considered under the influence of international law, can be seen as use of force. I think about the reason that led Russia to leave G8, that being the annexation of Crimea in Ukraine and his role on the Ukrainian civil war that ravaged the country a few years ago. I also think about some instances where Russian government really didn't shine when it came to accept liberal democracy. For instance, when there was, I think that to this day, there's a limit to the freedom of association in Russia. And there's also been some blatant attempts to eliminate some political adversaries, such as happened a few months ago with Mr. Navalny. Now, the question I wrote in the chat was actually much shorter, so I apologize if I made it a lot longer. But at first, my question was, how do you evaluate the clash between Europe and Russia in terms on human rights? And I apologize if I took my time to make a longer explanation. Thank you.
Well, I think that you are right in the sense that there is a fundamental difference in views on the world shared by the Russian leadership on the one hand, and most of European leaders on the other. The key issue is what direction the world is going in. If you believe that the future of the world is in multilateralism, in continuous globalization, in soft power, in cooperation, rather than competition or confrontation. If this is the future of the world, which in my view it should be, but if it is indeed the future of the world, then I think Russia at some point, with this generation or next generation of leaders, will have to adjust itself to this new vision. However, if Russian leaders are right, if the world is moving towards a new anarchy, to nationalisms, to the collapse of international organizations and international law, and we are entering a period of a war of all against all, then, of course, Putin has certain rationale for doing what he's doing right now. And of course, the Russian leadership is not the only one which shares this view of the world and its future. We can see essentially the same or similar positions taken by many leaders, from Erdogan to Trump. And I think it's a big question about who is right and who is wrong. We don't know. We don't know whether we see the end of globalization or not. We don't know whether we now observe the end of the United Nations or not. We can only hope that the future will be better than pessimists in Moscow or in Ankara or in Washington, D.C. can imagine. But definitely, it is still an open question. That's why I said that the success or failure of the European project is of paramount importance, not just to you, but it is also so important for us. We were used to look at Europe as a model. And of course, right now, it's no longer the case. So I share your position, but the problem is that, in my view, unfortunately, right now, liberalism, with its agenda of human rights, with its agenda of legalistic approach, and with its openness, with its universal values, liberalism is on the fence. And that creates a lot of incentives to all opponents of the liberal idea, be it in Russia or even in Europe itself. And that's a problem.
Okay, there is a question from Chiara. Can you go back to the third Russians' attempt to get close to the EU? Why did it fail?
Well, I think here I have to say, as you can see, I'm very critical of the Russian policy, but here I have to probably to impose most of the responsibility for this failure on the European side.
Ja,
Yeah,
aangetrokken.
well, let me say how it is. When you talk to European leaders about the Eurasian Economic Union as a potential second pillar of the Greater Europe, the answer is that, well, this is not serious. You know, this is not a real institution which can be regarded as a peer institution by the European Union. It's a Moscow project. It's a stillborn project. Every member of this union would be happy to switch sides and to get associated with the European Union if this member only had a chance to do so. I think that it was really difficult for the European Union to engage into a truly equal relationship with anyone, including big players like China and the United States. And they are ready to interact with the Eurasian Union at the technical level. They can share their practices and standards, their procedures. As you can see, the Eurasian Union is to some extent a carbon copy to the European Union in terms of the institutional development, but politically there is no appetite for treating the Eurasian Economic Union as equal. I think it's a mistake. I think that the Eurasian Union is either hopeless or harmless. It is hopeless if it is not based on structural reforms within member states that would create new drivers for economic development. And it's harmless if it remains just a union of rather, I would say, antiquated autocrats, because in this case, it will be no match for the European Union. So in my view, Brussels has very little to lose if it engages into a deeper interaction with the Eurasian Economic Union, but I understand the political limitations of that.
Okay, so there is a question from Marta. Marta, are you there? We cannot hear you. Yes, you're there. Happens. Something doesn't work with Marta, I think. So, okay, so I try to pose Marta's question. That is, some days ago, Russia's foreign minister Lavrov announced that the relation between Russia and the EU is probably coming to an end, or better said, to a change. That's also because China is gaining always more importance and power. What are your previsions about it?
Well, the European Union remains the largest trading partner of the Russian Federation. It accounts for more than 40% of the overall Russian trade. It remains the largest investor in Russia. It remains the largest source of technology transfer to Russia. All the sanctions notwithstanding, it is still an indispensable economic partner. So I think that what Lavrov probably meant, though, you know, I'm not in a position to interpret him, but I think he meant not the European Union, but rather the bureaucracy in Brussels. And in my opinion, this is one of the traditional approaches of Moscow, because in Moscow, for many, many years, they believe that it's nice to deal with individual member states, but it's impossible to deal with Brussels. So we might have good relations with Italy, with France, with Germany. We can go to Rome, to Berlin, and to Paris, but we don't need to go to Brussels, because it's a kind of lowest common denominator, and Brussels is hijacked by countries which are very critical of Russia, and they are acting as spoilers. They are blocking all initiatives. Well, you know this rhetoric. And I think that the problem with this approach is that in Moscow, sometimes they underestimate the centrality of the European integration for member states. You cannot go to Rome and solve all the problems without getting to Brussels as well. You can deal with Germany, but you should not forget that the central goal of the German foreign policy, which is by far more important than relations with any other country, be it Russia or the United States, is the European integration. So I think that in Russia, we still have not mastered our ability to deal with the European Union. It's a very comprehensive structure. It's not easy to deal with. Sometimes it is very disappointing. Sometimes it is frustrating. But I think that Russia, like any other country in the world, has to work with Brussels without trying to bypass Brussels and to approach individual member states directly.
Okay, there is a question from Gaetano. Gaetano, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Здравствуйте, professor. I'm sorry to bother you with the economics, but I'm very interested, and I wrote my question because it's a quite long question. So we see if I can use some of my words. So you have seen how the economic crisis of 2008 and at the latest with the COVID crisis, European member states suffered a lack of welfare state and a central role of the state in dealing with the crisis. And we can all agree now that the European monetary politics, neoliberal, with the only thing that matter is the market financial indicator, is not the solution to all problems. We have seen that. And we have seen that also in the ex-Soviet Union, East Central European countries, like, for example, Belarus, dealing with the post-Soviet economic problems. Do you think if Russia, with its fragile perisphere state economy, I'm talking about lands far from Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the welfare is more fragile. Do you think if Russia opens its market to the European Union and adopts its monetary politics as a risk of this type of a deep recession and worse conditions for its citizens, especially in the perisphere?
Let me say that when I think about the future of relations between Russia and the European Union in the economic field, I think that with all the problems and risks notwithstanding, we should gradually move to a free trade zone with the European Union. Maybe Russia can do it alone, maybe it can do it together with its partners within the Eurasian Economic Union, but I think that that should be the strategic destination of Russia. Of course, it will not come without a price. And if Russia opens up to the European Union, many sectors of the Russian economy will suffer. We know that. That's why, this movement should be made gradual and staged. However, when you think about standards and models, you can, for example, you can take public health or environment, climate change. I don't think that there is a better set of standards than in the European Union. I don't think that we can model our approach to some of these issues by standards used in the United States or in China, for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's an option. I don't think it's right. However, of course, we should look at the problems within the European Union. The European labor is very expensive. The European Union in some areas is losing its competitive edge to North America and to East Asia. The European Union runs a risk of, some say that it might become the industrial museum of the world. You probably thought that. So there are challenges, and that should be taken into account. But I think that you mentioned, the social dimension. I think socially, we are closer to the European Union than to any other part of the world. Yes, in Russia, probably you will see more paternalistic social contract than in most European states. But Europe, at least some parts of Europe, you take Italy, you take Southern Europe, you take Central Europe, these are quite paternalistic systems. So the gap is not that huge, in my opinion. And the question is exactly to remove the political obstacles for such cooperation. Because, and I will end with that, but since you you mentioned economic problems, let me tell you what I'm particularly concerned about as far as economic relations between Russia and Europe is concerned. Traditionally, over the last 20 years, 30 years, this relationship was quite primitive but robust. We sold our oil and gas to Europe. From Europe, we received primarily consumer goods and some technologies. But I think that both ends of this equation, both parts of this equation are now in jeopardy. Europe is likely to need less and less of the Russian hydrocarbons. On the Russian consumer market, you will see Asia gradually replacing European partners. So one of the key issues, if we put aside Ukraine, if we put aside this alleged Russian interference in the political process in Europe, if you just take the economic dimension, I think that the challenge for the two sides to find a new foundation for their economic interaction, something beyond the Russian oil and gas, something beyond the European consumer goods, something that would entail joint technological chains, like, engage in Russia in these technological platforms, as you say, in Europe. And this is very difficult because there is no experience, there are no traditions of such an engagement, and that is possible only if we remove the security dimension. Because if we cannot do it, I don't know, maybe you're too young to remember the notorious Opel case, when Russia tried to buy Opel from Germans. But Americans blocked the deal because they were concerned that Russia will be too engaged in the European technological process. No, Russia has been engaged in Airbus, in the European project. I think we still have maybe 1% of shares here, but of course, for security reasons, deep integration became impossible. So if we're able to resolve some of the political issues, then I think it's possible to look for a new foundation for our economic relations as well.
Spasiba вам большое.
Okay, so there is a last question, I think, from Alberto, who has some problems with the microphone. So please let me read it. I have a question on EU-Russia relations with Iran. We have seen a progressive American disengagement in the MENA region, Middle East and Northern Africa regions, with the under Trump administration. Meanwhile, Russia has increased its presence and was one of the few countries near to Iran, a country really important for the stability in the Middle East. In its past years of isolation. So my question is, will Russia help Europe to reinforce the relation with Iran? Another question, considering that Iran has the second largest gas reserve after Russia, could Russia be so collaborative in order to preserve his energetic strategic planes with Europe? It is not clear to me, this second question. However, the word is yours, Andrei.
Well, first of all, I fully agree that Russia and Europe have similar approaches to Iran, and the Russian and the European position are close to each other than they are to the US position. We can only hope that if Joe Biden is elected, maybe there'll be a shift of the US attitude towards the Islamic Republic, and there'll be some kind of rapprochement, at least limited rapprochement, between Washington and Tehran. But definitely, Russia would be very interested in working with the EU on preserving GCPOA in the first place, but also in somehow fighting against US unilateral sanctions. I think that when you go to Iran, they more or less know what they can expect from Moscow, but they don't know what they can expect from Europe. So here, I think Europe might be even more important than Moscow. Though for us, Iran is really critical, not just in the Middle East, but also in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in Southern Caucasus, in the Caspian Sea region. So Iran for Russia is quite a critical partner. Though on certain issues we cannot agree. For example, we do not share Iranian views on Israel. And of course, this is a permanent irritant in the Russian-Iranian relations. Now, in terms of gas, in theory, Iran can become a serious competitor to Russia in the European gas market. However, my take is that if Iran is able to overcome its current economic isolation imposed primarily by the United States, its first destination will be Eastern and Southern Asia. They will explore opportunities primarily in India and in China. But I see nothing wrong about Russia and Iran competing for European markets, provided that Europeans treat Russia and Iran fairly, that both countries have the same terms in dealing with their consumers in Europe. I think that with LNG, and in case of Iran, we are talking about LNG, and we are talking about the spot market primarily, it is easier to somehow segregate economic relations from political considerations. When you get down to pipelines, I think pipelines are likely to be politicized forever. It's very difficult to imagine how you can avoid a political dimension of such projects. But with LNG, I think probably in the end of the day, we will see the gas market evolving in the direction of the oil market. And I think that will be positive for both consumers and producers. We're not there yet, but we are moving in this direction.
Okay, so there is a last question. There is a last question from Victoria. Victoria, are you there? From Russia. From Ranepa. Yeah.
So, спасибо за лекцию. And I have a question. What impact can the conflict between the USA and China have on relationships between Russia and Europe, and if it will be some impact, because this could extend the individual opportunities to increase the influences for Russia and for Europe. So what do you think about that? I would like to know.
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I think that this growing US-Chinese confrontation is bad. For Europe, it's bad for Russia, it's bad for everybody. Some people in Moscow probably heard such a view that if we watch a growing US-Chinese confrontation, Russia can benefit from that because Russia will be more important for Beijing as its strategic partner. I personally disagree with that. I think it's a rather short-sighted vision of the situation. But let me say that, in my opinion, if indeed we will continue to observe these growing tensions between Beijing and Washington, both Russia and the European Union will be challenged to live in a rigid bipolar world. And this is not good for us because it will deprive us from the space for maneuvering, because we will be chained to our respective partners. The European Union will have to choose the United States over China, and Russia will have to choose China over not just the United States, but also its allies and partners. So in my opinion, the role of Russia and the European Union might be in softening this bipolarity, to make sure that the world is not limited to this confrontation. And that implies, of course, more cooperation between the two sides, more joint projects, more attempts to work together within international organizations on issues like, for example, the one that has been mentioned already, the Iranian issue. I think there are opportunities there. And I hope that this China-US clash will not create additional problems between Russia and Europe, but instead would incentivize both sides to working together on issues of common interest. The situation today, unfortunately, is not very encouraging, but I still hope that we will be able to overcome at least some of the current problems and to get down to more cooperation in areas where we are so far are not constrained by sanctions or by our alliances that are going to emerge in this disintegrated world.
Okay, Andrei, are you ready for a very, very last question?
Of course.
Okay, the last one from Victor. Victor, are you there?
Yeah, can you see me?
Victor, yes, he's
so
there.
My question, okay.
Yeah.
So I have a slightly different question for you, Professor Kortunov. You're not what is happening today. I would like to express a consideration about the role of Russia in Prednistrovia. And although the Kremlin has repeatedly denied its involvement in the Prednistrovian issue, the numerous judgments of the European Court of Human Rights have shown that the extent of Russian jurisdiction in Moldovan territory. So my question is very easy. Can the Russian presence on Moldovan territory can interpret as an attempt by Moscow to maintain a sort of buffer zone, buffer zone between itself and Europe, as in a future attempt by Russia itself to expand the influence in the former Soviet country? So thank you for in advance.
If you remember, not a long time ago, when all of the Moldovans got fed up with Mr. Plakhatnyuk, Russia and the European Union joined forces in order to have a transition to a more representative, less corrupt, and more decent political system. And I had a couple of conversations with my European friends there, and I thought that probably this is exactly an example of how we should work together. Because, of course, this coalition was, which replaced Plakhatnyuk, this coalition was quite diverse. But nevertheless, I think it was a major success story. Unfortunately, it didn't last for too long. I think it fell apart, not because of disagreements between Russia and the European Union, but because of domestic developments inside Moldova. But my take is that we should still work in this direction, not only in Moldova, but in many other places which can be regarded as a common neighborhood for Russia and the European Union. Specifically speaking of Moldova, I think that right now it's not the biggest headache for the Russian leadership. I think that they are much more concerned about what's going on in Belarus, about the developments in the South Caucasus, and about still unclear situation in Kyrgyzstan. So my hope and my proposal would be that in case of Moldova, we could probably reach out to the European Union to see how we can assist the country in finally resolving the residual Prednistrovia problem. And I don't think that Russia is interested in funding this territory forever. It is now much more difficult after 2014. So I think that we can probably regard Moldova not only as a divisive factor between Russia and the European Union, but also as an opportunity to do something together. Of course, I might sound too optimistic. I know that there is no consensus in Moscow whether Russia should work with the European Union on Moldovan issues, but I wouldn't exclude that we will have some kind of understanding with the European Union on what should and what should not be done in this particular place.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrei, for your fantastic lecture, and and thank you, students, for your very interesting questions. There is much food for thought for all of us, I think. So thank you very much again, and see you soon. See you soon on WebEx, and Region Europe. Thank you very much. And
thank all of you, and it's always a pleasure And I wish you well. I wish that we will overcome the coronavirus, and I wish to get to Turin before too long.
Yeah, very soon, Andrei.
Okay, God. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So thank you again, and see you soon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Bye
luck.
bye. Good luck. Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao.
Yeah. Yeah.